So just to ask you both, so Khalil, you already know this, right? So Sayyid Hussein Nasr, in his conception of Neoplatonic thought, he correlates these archetypes with a species, understood in the biological sense. So for the sake of the argument, I'm not sure he uses this example, but take it as it is. So you have an archetype of a cat, and then you have the species of cat. Now, Hasnain, what I wanted to ask you was, in your metaphysical model, in your theological model, would you consider possible that these cats, if you allowed a million years to span, would these cats be able to evolve such that their mahiyya would change? And if it did change, if it could change, what would that mean in terms of it being reflected under these fixed, immutable archetypes? Because that's what Sayyid Hassan Nasr seems to argue. Because he believes that because that species correspond to archetypes which are immutable, ergo evolution cannot happen. It is metaphysically impossible. So that's what I wanted to ask you.
Okay. Now, I think when you say, now that you have, elaborated a bit more, I think what you're referring to as fixed eternal archetypes are basically the horizontal immaterial separate intellects, or the uqul mujarrada aradiyya. So in the Neoplatonic, philosophical model, cosmological model, you have the one, or God, okay, from which emanates the a series of immaterial intellects. So you have a series of vertical immaterial intellects. You cannot confine their number, okay. So for some, there are 10. For some, there could be more than 10, regardless. So you have a series of immaterial intellects emanating from the one, okay? And then from the last of those vertical immaterial intellects, the last of those intellects is referred to as the active intellect or the agent intellect. In Arabic, we call it aql fa'al. So the aql fa'al is the principle of the horizontal immaterial intellects, which are the uqul aradiyya mujarrada. Now, these horizontal immaterial intellects are basically, you can say, they are the principles or the sources of the material, the sensible species that exist in the sublunary world. Okay, that is the physical world, or the material world. So, for instance, if there are trees over here in this physical world, so there has to be, the trees over here in this physical world are imperfect or incomplete, imitations or copies of the intelligible tree, okay, the shajar aqli that exists in the intelligible realm, or the alam al-aql, or if there are horses in this sensible world, sensible, cosmos. So these sensible horses are imperfect or incomplete imitations or copies of the intellectual or the intelligible horse that can be found in the intelligible world, the faras aqli, basically, okay. So they say, according to the philosophers, these horizontal immaterial intellects are the mudabbir, of the affairs of the species that corresponds to them. So the faras aqli is the principle, and it manages all the affairs of the sensible horses. Similarly, the shajar aqli, is a principle, and it manages all the affairs of pertaining to the sensible trees, and so on and so forth. Now, coming to your question, now you say that the cats evolve, okay, and they cease to be cats. If they cease to be cats and if they evolve, so they would automatically, I use the word automatic, probably automatic is not an appropriate term, but just to give the idea, okay, they would start receiving illumination or the effusion of grace from the principle, the intellectual source of the principle that corresponds to them at the moment of their transition. So if they were, prior to the transition, if they were animals or if they were cats,
okay.
So they were receiving the effusion of grace or faith, okay, from the haywan aqli, Okay, for instance, okay, just to take one example. Now, if they cease to be haywan, or if they cease to be cats, and if they become some other animal, okay, so whatever intellectual principle corresponds to that particular species, they would immediately start receiving and absorbing the effusion of divine grace from that particular source. Are you getting my point? Okay, so the faith, okay, never ceases.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
The faith never ceases. It keeps pouring like rain. Okay. Now you may cover one bucket with, with a lid or a covering. Okay, and that bucket may transform itself into some other vessel. Okay, but this does not imply change or mutability in the rain that is falling. The rain is constantly pouring forth ceaselessly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Shoaib, Houston Smith actually says something like this. He says that the world of archetypes has all these different archetypes. The archetypes also reflect it on each other. So you can actually have multiple archetypes sometimes manifesting in a material thing, So it's like you have the material.
So you can have combinations. You can have combinations.
I mean, there's nothing to my knowledge. People like to conflate the terrestrial and the celestial, which I think is what Dr. Nasser does. Right? He just assumes that a biological species is identical to the celestial species, but I don't think that necessarily follows. If you distinguish between terrestrial species, which are in flux, and then you have immutable celestial species, I cannot see any reason to think that a particular terrestrial moment in evolution is receiving emanation, right, from one or more celestial archetypes. I can't see anything, a problem with that, right? And if we look at the evolution of the Homo sapien, it's possible that the Neanderthal and the Homo sapien, that we actually we're both human from the celestial perspective. But although biologically we're different, right? I mean, you would know better than I, but we're not Neanderthals, right? They have a different genome than us. But it seems that the Neanderthal had the same intellectual capacities as humans, and we intermarried with them, and they just had, they look different. But from a dispositional perspective, these are two species terrestrially that are reflecting the celestial form of man or archetype of man.